The silence that fell over the church was so profound you could hear the heartbeat of every person present. The pastor, standing at the pulpit, had frozen mid-sentence. The entire congregation, 300 people, held their breath all at once. And in the midst of it all, a cruel laugh that came from the back of the church stopped abruptly, as if someone had cut the sound with scissors. But before we reveal why the pastor interrupted the entire service, why that woman in the front row began to cry, and why the man who was laughing was now pale as paper, we need to go back 3 weeks in time, to an elegant living room, where an apparently respectable family was about to discover that not everything that glitters is gold. Meet Sarah, a 42-year-old woman, a literature teacher, single mother of 2 teenage children, living in a modest apartment in the suburbs. 15 years raising children alone, 15 years facing pitying glances at the boys' school, 15 years being invisible at family gatherings where everyone spoke of achievements she could never reach. Sarah had always possessed that kind of quiet beauty that doesn't shout but whispers. The kind of woman who passes unnoticed in a crowd, until you look into her eyes and perceive a depth that unsettles you. She carried a silent dignity, as if guarding a secret that the world was not yet ready to know. And meet Richard, her half-brother. Ah, Richard, 45 years old, corporate lawyer, owner of a penthouse apartment in the city center, driving a Mercedes that shone brighter than his sense of empathy. Richard was the kind of man who entered a room as if the floor was unworthy of his $2,000 Italian shoes. He wore custom-made suits that cost more than Sarah's car, Swiss watches that gleamed on his wrist like trophies of war, and had that smile that seemed to say, "I know I'm better than you, and you know it too." The family meeting had been scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at the home of their deceased mother, Helen, a Victorian mansion in the city's upscale neighborhood, with gardens that looked like they came from a decorating magazine and a living room larger than Sarah's entire apartment. The family lawyer, Mr. Anderson, a 60-year-old man with reading glasses hanging from his nose, was sitting behind a mahogany desk, holding a sealed envelope. Sarah arrived promptly at 3 o'clock. Always punctual, always polite, always trying not to take up too much space. She wore a simple navy blue dress, no jewelry, no dramatic makeup. She sat in a chair in the corner of the room, her hands delicately crossed in her lap, waiting, observing. Richard arrived 20 minutes late. Important men always have important commitments. He entered as if the house already belonged to him, threw his jacket on the sofa, loosened his tie, and helped himself to a Scotch whiskey from the bar without asking permission. Without waiting, simply taking what he believed was already his. "We can start now that I'm here," Richard announced, as if his presence were the main event. Mr. Anderson cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the envelope with a letter opener. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the room like an omen. "Last will and testament of Helen Mitchell," he began, his monotone voice carrying the weight of countless similar readings. "I leave my primary residence, located at 230 Oak Street, together with all furnishings, artwork, and personal belongings, to my son, Richard Mitchell." Richard smiled. Of course he smiled. The satisfied smile of someone who always knew the universe would conspire in his favor. "I leave my jewelry collection, including the pearl necklace that belonged to my grandmother, to my son, Richard Mitchell." The smile grew wider. Richard crossed his legs, leaned back on the sofa as if it were a throne, and took another sip of whiskey. "I leave my bank accounts, investments, and securities, which total approximately $200,000, to my son, Richard Mitchell." Sarah didn't move. Not a blink. She simply remained seated, those delicate hands still crossed, her face serene like a lake before the storm. Mr. Anderson continued, "As for my daughter Sarah," he paused, a pause far too long to be comfortable. "I leave the sum of $1,000 with the hope that she uses this amount to establish her independence." $1,000. $1,000. Compared to Richard's $200,000. Compared to the mansion. Compared to the family jewels spanning generations. The silence that followed was broken by Richard's laughter. Not a nervous giggle. Not a restrained smile. But a loud, cruel laugh that reverberated through the room like shattering glass. $1,000! He practically shouted between laughs. Mom really knew how to evaluate people by what they're worth, didn't she? Mr. Anderson looked at him over his glasses with silent disapproval, but Richard didn't care. Men like Richard rarely care about anyone's disapproval. "What are you going to buy with that, Sarah? A used car? Some lessons on being less mediocre?" He raised his whiskey glass in a sarcastic toast. "To your independence." 3 other people were present in that room. Aunt Margaret, Cousin Cecilia, and Cousin Robert. All rich. All connected to the side of the family that had old money and important surnames. And they all laughed. Not as loudly as Richard, but they laughed. That kind of awkward laughter that people give when they want to be part of the winning group. Sarah finally moved. She stood up, slow and deliberate, smoothed her navy blue dress with the palms of her hands, and looked directly at Richard. Not with anger, not with tears, with something far more disturbing, absolute calm. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Please process the transfer of $1,000 to my account." And then she looked at Richard, really looked, directly into his eyes with an intensity that made his smile falter for a fraction of a second. "I accept our mother's decision," Sarah said, "and I wish you everything you deserve, Richard. Everything." Something in the way she said "everything you deserve" made the air in the room grow colder. It was not a blessing. It was a prophecy. Richard quickly regained his smile. "Ah, how dramatic. Always been like that, wasn't it, Sarah? Always trying to be the noble victim. But let's be honest here." He stood up, walked over to her, deliberately invading her personal space. "Mom left you out of the real will because you were never really part of this family, were you? Child of the second marriage. The outsider, the one who never belonged." He said this in front of everyone, with witnesses, with the casual cruelty of someone who never had to worry about consequences. "You were always dead weight, Sarah." A mistake that Mom had to carry out of courtesy. And now, finally, even she's officially acknowledged it. Sarah didn't respond. She simply picked up her purse, a worn leather purse that had seen better days, and walked toward the door. "Running away again?" Richard shouted after her. "That's what you do best, isn't it? Disappear. Be invisible. Be nothing!" Sarah's hand was on the doorknob when she stopped. For a moment, just a moment, she turned her head slightly to the side, just enough so Richard could see her profile. "Invisibility has its advantages, Richard," she said calmly. "Invisible people see things that important people never notice." And then she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded more threatening than a bang. Richard turned to the gathered relatives, still laughing. "Dramatic to the end. Well, more whiskey for us, right? We're celebrating!" He filled his glass again, pouring the amber liquid generously. "To my inheritance. To justice! And to finally getting rid of that pathetic shadow." But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew at that moment as they toasted and laughed and divided the spoils of the deceased Helen, was that Sarah wasn't running away. Sarah was waiting, because that calm she showed wasn't resignation. It was knowledge. It was the kind of serenity that comes when you know something that no one else knows. When you hold cards that no one else imagines you have. When you know that in exactly 3 weeks, everything that Richard thought he had gained would be ripped from him in front of 300 people. 3 weeks after that humiliating afternoon, something would happen. Something that would turn those laughs into silence. Something that would make Richard wish he had been kind when he had the chance. But what the family didn't know was that Helen had been a woman far smarter than any of them imagined. She had spent the last years of her life watching, testing, seeing who really cared and who was just waiting for the inheritance, and she had left something for Sarah. Something that wasn't in that will read aloud. Something that would change everything. But that would only be revealed in the last place Richard would expect, in the church. Grace Community Church had been the center of social life in that city for over 100 years. It stood atop a hill, its white steeple visible for miles around, its bells ringing every morning at 7 o'clock sharp. It was where weddings happened, where baptisms were celebrated, where funerals were held. It was where reputations were built and destroyed. Richard attended that church every Sunday, not out of faith but for appearances. He sat in the 4th pew on the left, always well-dressed, always smiling, always greeting important people. The mayor sat 3 benches behind. The owner of the city's largest company sat to the right. The church was less a place of worship and more a social club for those who wanted to be seen. Sarah also attended the same church, but she sat in the back near the door, almost invisible. She arrived 2 minutes before the service began and left first, always avoiding conversations. Invisible, as always. On that specific Sunday, 3 weeks after the will was read, the sun streamed through the stained glass windows, creating patterns of colored light on the marble floor. Pastor Thompson, a 70-year-old man who knew each secret of that congregation better than they did themselves, was at the pulpit about to begin his sermon. Richard was sitting in his usual place, discreetly browsing his phone, pretending to pay attention. He had used the inheritance money to buy a new watch. Rolex, white gold, $40,000. He made sure everyone could see it. Sarah was in her usual place, in the last pew. But something was different that Sunday. She was not looking down. She was looking directly ahead, waiting. It was when Pastor Thompson cleared his throat in a way that made the entire congregation pay attention. It wasn't his usual "I'm about to speak" tone. It was his "something important is about to happen" tone. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing through the nave. "Before today's sermon, I have a special announcement to make. A last wish of our beloved sister Helen Mitchell, who departed to the Lord 5 weeks ago. Richard stopped looking at his cell phone. His entire body went rigid. Helen came to me 6 months before her death, Pastor Thompson continued. She handed me a sealed envelope with very specific instructions. This envelope was only to be opened 4 weeks after her funeral, on a Sunday, during the service, in front of the entire congregation. The silence in the church was absolute. She specified, Pastor Thompson said, his eyes sweeping the congregation until they found Richard, that her son, Richard, should be present. All eyes turned to Richard. 300 pairs of eyes. Richard forced a smile. Of course, Pastor. I'm here. Mom always had a dramatic sense of timing. He tried to sound casual, but his voice betrayed growing nervousness. Pastor Thompson opened the envelope slowly. He pulled several papers out. His eyes read silently, and for just a moment, one moment, he looked at Richard with something that looked like pity. And then he looked at Sarah in the back of the church and nodded. Sarah stood up, slowly, deliberately, and began walking down the center aisle toward the altar. Each step of hers echoed in the silence. Click, click, click. Her simple shoes on the marble sounded like a countdown. Richard was pale now. "What's happening?" he whispered, but loud enough for the nearby pews to hear. Sarah reached the front of the church and stood beside Pastor Thompson. She did not look at Richard. Not yet. "The will read by Mr. Anderson," Pastor Thompson began, his voice clear and firm, "was genuine. Richard truly did inherit the house, the jewels, and the bank accounts from Helen." Richard visibly relaxed. "Then why all this drama?" "But," Pastor Thompson interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade, "that was not the only will that Helen left." The air left Richard's lungs all at once. 3 years ago, Pastor Thompson continued, Helen created a trust fund, a fund that she built over 15 years, discreetly selling properties and investments that Richard never knew existed. Aunt Margaret in the fifth pew gasped audibly. "This trust fund," Pastor Thompson said, "valued at $800,000. The congregation erupted in murmurs, was left entirely to Sarah Mitchell. And it was at that exact moment, that precise moment, that Richard began to laugh. Not a laugh of joy, a laugh of disbelief. A laugh that started low and grew until it became hysterical. A laugh that echoed through the entire church, ricocheting off the stone walls, rising to the vaulted ceiling. And it was exactly at that moment that the pastor froze, that the congregation held its breath. That silence fell like a heavy curtain, because Sarah finally looked at Richard and smiled. The silence that took hold of the church was almost palpable. No one moved. No one dared to breathe loudly. It was as if time had frozen in that sacred instant, where the truth had just exploded like lightning over the congregation. Pastor Thompson looked out at the crowd, his expression as serious as granite. "But before we celebrate anything," he said, raising his hand, "we need to understand what really happened here." He breathed deeply, like someone about to deliver a verdict. "What Helen left written in this envelope," he continued, holding the document as if it were a sacred relic, "is more than information about inheritance. It is a letter to this congregation, to the community, to explain why she structured her estate this way. The tension in the church was sharp enough to cut. In this letter," said Pastor Thompson, beginning to read aloud, "Helen speaks about character, about how a parent should test their children to discover who they truly are. She says, 'During my final years of life I observed my children. I saw how they treated others. I saw their choices when they thought no one was watching, and I made my decisions based on what I saw.'" The congregation's eyes gravitated between Richard, who remained pale, motionless, and Sarah, who watched with that unwavering calm. "She continues," read the pastor, his voice gaining authority. "I left to Richard what he always valued, status, visible properties, external signs of wealth, because I knew his heart. I knew his need to appear well. I knew his sense of superiority, and I knew that would be his greatest trap." Richard's wife, who had positioned herself strategically near him, looked away. People nearby slowly began to increase their distance from him, as if humiliation were contagious. "But for Sarah," Pastor Thompson continued, his voice now softer, yet no less powerful, "I left the true wealth, not because she was perfect, but because she was worthy, because she carried a silent strength that no amount of malice from her brother could break. Sarah chose dignity when everyone humiliated her. Sarah chose silence when she could have defended herself. Sarah chose to be better, not to be admired, but because it was who she was." The pastor paused, allowing Helen's words to penetrate each heart present. "And then Helen writes something we all must hear," he continued, and there was emotion in his voice. "My greatest regret is not being clear about these values while I was still alive. Perhaps if I had been more explicit, Richard would have understood. But there is wisdom too in letting people discover these truths through their own experiences. Truth, when it arrives, leaves a deeper mark than any sermon or advice could ever leave. Richard finally tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse, weak. "Pastor, Helen never. She never said that." Pastor Thompson raised his hand, silencing him not with anger but with compassion. "Let this be a lesson for all of us," said the pastor, turning to the congregation. "A lesson about the power of character. A lesson about how truth always emerges. And a lesson about how we misjudge others based on appearances, when the truth lies hidden beneath." He looked at Sarah with a smile of approval. "Sarah, would you like to say something?" Sarah took a deep breath and stood up. When she spoke, her voice echoed through the church with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. "I came to this church today," she began, "not to boast, not to humiliate anyone. I came because this is where my mother found peace and wisdom. Here, where she learned to see beyond appearances." She paused, her eyes meeting Richard's. "My mother left me everything not because I was better than him, but because she knew that real wealth is not in money. It is in who you choose to be. It is in how you treat people when no one is watching. It is in your capacity to be humble, even when you could be arrogant." Sarah turned to the congregation. "I could have revealed the truth at any time," she continued. "I could have humiliated Richard the way he humiliated me. I could have shouted about the injustice, about his cruelty, but I chose not to, because revenge would have transformed me into someone I am not." An elderly couple in the front had tears streaming down their faces. People around them whispered, their comments now radically different from what they had been minutes before. "And today," Sarah continued, "when the truth emerges, it is not through my revenge. It is through our mother's will. It is through her wisdom continuing to guide us, even after her death." She looked one last time at Richard. "I forgive you, Richard," Sarah said, and there was true strength in those words. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace, and because holding resentment would only poison me. You can keep your properties, your symbols of status, but I have something money can never buy, my integrity." Richard collapsed in that instant. He fell to his knees, his shoulders trembling as his arrogance crumbled into complete despair. The congregation, witnessing his fall, remained in respectful silence. Pastor Thompson looked at the congregation and spoke the final words. "Let this story live in our hearts forever. Let us learn that truth always emerges. Let us understand that character is worth more than any material inheritance. And let us never again commit the sin of judging based on appearances." He took a deep breath. "As the wise people of Africa teach, the tree that bends in the wind survives. The proud tree breaks." Sarah bent gracefully. She kept her dignity, and she survived. That, my brothers, is true character. The pastor looked at the congregation and extended his hands in blessing. "May the Lord bless and keep us. May he make us understand that truth, even when it takes time, always prevails. May he make us humble, merciful, and wise in our judgments. May he give us Sarah's strength to choose dignity over revenge. Amen." "Amen," the congregation responded, their voices united in profound accord. When Sarah came down from the altar and walked back to her pew, something extraordinary happened. People stood up, not in defiance, but in genuine respect, in recognition. And that respect, that silent admiration, was something that no amount of money could ever buy. Richard remained on his knees, unable to move, unable to meet the faces of those who watched him. The humiliation he had tried to inflict on Sarah had reversed completely, striking him with a force 10 times greater. But the truth is that he deserved it. The truth is that, in a world where appearance often triumphs over essence, Helen had been too wise. Wise enough to structure things so that, finally, character would win. Finally, dignity would win. Finally, truth would win. And as the congregation slowly dispersed, the whispers changed completely. The people who moments before pointed fingers now asked for forgiveness. The people who laughed now cried. The entire community had been transformed by a simple truth revealed at the right moment. Because sometimes justice doesn't come quickly. But when it comes with a force that changes everything. The pastor's response brought the entire church to a standstill, and Sarah's truth truly transformed everything. As Sarah had said, and as Helen had understood, the truth always emerges. And when it does, those who lived in arrogance and judgment have nowhere to hide. And so ends the story of "You Are Out of the Will." A story of delayed justice, vindicated character, and ancestral wisdom prevailing over modern greed. A story that reminds us that what truly matters is not material wealth, but the character we inherit and pass on to the world. What a powerful story of truth triumphing over appearance, of dignity defeating arrogance. If you believe Sarah did the right thing by choosing silence and dignity, leave your comment. Tell me, would you have revealed the truth immediately, or would you have waited like Sarah? Subscribe to our channel for more stories of moral justice, of African ancestral wisdom, of character being tested and vindicated, because these stories define us, teach us, transform us. Thank you for watching until the end. Until the next story. And remember this, the truth can never stay hidden. Never.